Hello everybody, Noah Legel with Hyperion Blade Works, and we are going to be getting started on the Community Knife Build project. I actually recorded this little intro, only to find out later that the audio didn't work. So I'm going to just let you guys know that this is a chunk of leaf spring steel that I'll be using to make the 14 to 16 inch Bowie that was voted on. So as my forging diagram shows in step 1, we want to knock in one of the corners at the end of our stock so that we can establish the point for our blade. Now, I actually did this on the wrong side, which I'll get to a little bit later in the video, but it's an easy enough thing to fix. Now, this is something that a lot of smiths just don't want to do. They'll cut the tip of the blade in instead because it's faster or easier for them. But I like actually forging the point in this way, because if you're going to be, forging blades, it makes sense to forge as much of it as possible and do as little grinding as possible, at least in my opinion. You can see here that I periodically flip the steel and put it flat on the face of the anvil after I've been working the edge for a bit, and that's just to work down the mushrooming that happens when you're hammering on the edges of the steel and get the stock flattened back out the way I want it to be. Now we're moving on to step 2, which is stretching the steel out lengthwise. You can see that I've turned my hammer to an angle so that I can use the side of the square face as a fullering tool. This is going to help stretch it primarily lengthwise and not spread it out widthwise as well. Another way to accomplish the same thing is by using the edge of your anvil as a fullering tool. You don't want to do this with a sharp edge. You need to make sure that you've got a rounded edge on the anvil, but essentially you can use the flat face of your hammer and the corner of the anvil's edge as a fullering tool to get that same stretching effect. And you do periodically need to flatten things back out and hammer the high points back down so that they're flush with the low points, but it does a good job. At this point, it's just a matter of repetition. We have to keep fullering the steel and then flattening it back out. Now, we want to do more fullering towards the end of the blade than we want to do towards the handle end, because we want to establish distal taper, which is where the blade decreases in thickness as you get closer to the point. And you can see here that I'm laying it across the face of my anvil. Partially that's to flatten it, but it's also checking for length, because the length of the face of my anvil is 13 inches and we're going for 14 to 16 inches. At this point, I'm pretty sure I've got the length that I need, so I'm just doing a little bit of cleanup on some of the deeper hammer marks and then checking the length again, and we've got probably about 14.5 inches of blade length. Now it's time for step 3 of the forging plan, which is cutting the knife off of the rest of the stock that we're using. Now, I'm just cutting it with a chisel I made using a railroad spike. This is much easier to do if you use a Hardy hot cut tool, but I have not taken the time to make it. And I also tried to keep the steel laid across the face of the anvil so you could see it better on video, but as you can see, it rocks around quite a bit while I'm doing that. This is much easier to do with the stock turned so that it's resting on the step of my anvil and my leg can brace the back end. It's just much more well controlled this way and doesn't rock all over the place, but it is a little harder for you guys to see the cut happening. To reduce wear and tear on my anvil, I don't cut it all the way through with the chisel. I just cut it enough that I can bend the piece enough to break it free. And at this point, it's time to start moving on to step 4 and stretching out the steel that's going to become the full tang of our knife. This process is essentially identical to when we were stretching out the blade, but we want to keep our fullering relatively even all the way down the length of the tang, because the tang is going to have parallel edges rather than distal taper the way the blade does. So this is where we're leaving off for the time being. We've established the point, we've stretched out the blade and given it some distal taper, and we've cut it off the stock and started to isolate the tang. Now you'll notice that around the ricasso area, there's a notch already in the steel, and that comes from a hole that was present in the leaf spring itself. I could taper the tang into that ricasso area so that it's more like the design that I had drawn in my concept art, but I actually like the fact that that divot gives me a bit of steel to work with at the front side of the handle, because it means that I can put some flare on the front end and have that act as a bit of a guard to prevent your hand from sliding forward onto the blade if you're doing any thrusting, since this Bowie is not going to have a traditional guard. But this also presents a problem with the way we forged in the point. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I forged the point in the wrong direction. And that's because when I started, I didn't think that the notch that was in the steel was going to be something that I would incorporate into the blade, so it didn't really matter which corner of the stock I hammered in. But because once I got the blade stretched out and I decided to use that notch, that means that the point I've forged in is on the wrong side of the steel. Yes, it may seem like it is where the point needs to go, because typically the point of a blade like this is going to be closer to the spine than to the edge, but because we're going to be forging the bevels in, we actually need that tip to be angled down towards the edge side instead. Now, this is really easy to fix. All I have to do is heat up the end and hammer that point down so that it's in line with the edge side of the steel, but it is a mistake that I wanted to point out because it's an easy one to make, but it's also an easy one to fix. Hello everybody, Noah Lego with Hyperion Bladeworks again, and we are back working on the Community Knife Build project. As you can see, we are on step 5 of my forging plan, which is forging the curves into the tang so that the handle has the shape that you guys voted for. I didn't start recording at the very beginning of this process, but you can see that I'm continuing to work on that here. I'm using the horn of the anvil and a rounding hammer to get those curves forged in. And right here I'm actually bending the handle section over the horn a little bit just so that we have a little bit of curve to make that a little more ergonomic. Now that we have the tang shaped, we can move on to step 6, which is putting a forward curve in the blade. You can see that I'm doing that just by tapping the blade over the horn of the anvil. And you want to do this because when you forge the bevels in, it's going to spread the steel along the edge, which is going to make the blade want to curve backward. And we want to have a straight blade in the end. Now I'm going to fix the mistake that I made in the last video where I forged the point in so that it was aligned with the spine of the blade, because we want it to be aligned with the edge of the blade. And this is for the same reason that we put that forward curve in. When you forge the bevels, it's going to naturally make the blade want to curve backward. So if you put the point in line with the edge, it's actually going to bend upward so that it's more centered along the blade. As you can see, it's a pretty easy process. You just forge that point down and periodically lay it flat so that you can smooth things back out, and you can put it in line with the edge the way it's supposed to be. With that correction out of the way, we can move on to step 7, which is forging in the bevels. And as you can see here, I like using the front edge of the face of my anvil to do this, because my hammer can overhang that edge, which allows you to get a really fine bevel. I don't actually make a terribly fine bevel on this blade because I'm keeping it pretty thick, since chunky blades are in fashion at the moment. And you don't strictly need to do it this way. You can see that I'm working on the other side of the bevel here on the face of the anvil, but it is still my preferred method most of the time that I'm forging in bevels. And this process is pretty repetitive, but as you can see, it's starting to straighten out the blade already. Now, once you've gotten the bevel fully forged in, you can do this same sort of trick that I used to put a forward curve in the blade by smacking the back of the blade along the face of the anvil to straighten things back out. Because of course, your hammer work isn't going to be perfect, and things can get a little out of alignment in the process. At this point, I just need to do a bit of cleanup work, so I'm going to go back over the bevels to smooth out any hammer marks that are particularly uneven that might be difficult to get out on the grinder, and I can also refine the back of the blade to make sure that it's fairly straight and smooth. There's going to be little deviations as well just from using a hammer, but I don't want to grind that out, so I want to keep it fairly smooth so that there's not weird wobbles in the back of the blade. Now, I forgot to add putting my maker's mark on the blade in the forging plan, and so step 8 only shows that I planned to mark the holes for the pins that are going to go through the tang, which I forgot to record, but I did record putting my maker's mark on the ricasso area of the blade. Now, after you've done this, you do need to make sure that things are straight again. Anytime you use a punch or a stamp on steel, it can deform it, so a little bit of correction needs to be made here and there. Now, overall, I'm really happy with how this came out as forged. This is purely hammerwork, absolutely zero grinding, and it is ready to move on to the grinder to refine the shape a little bit and put the bevels on so that we can then move on to the final stages.